Hello again, and welcome to another exciting episode. Today we are experimenting with a nation. And actually, I know that depending on when you are reading or listening to this, it is the day before or day after break. So this is going to be a nice, short, not too difficult one for you, but it is important to do it. So we are reading a chapter of a book. You may have seen them in the back corner of my room back here. There's a whole series of them, one for each unit, basically. This one is book 2, Making 13 Colonies by Joy Hacom. Now, this has won all kinds of awards, and they're okay. So they do some really good things and some that I'm not so great at. If you would prefer to just read it, I will put it down very bottom in Cami so you can read it, but you really need to read it. If not, I'm going to read it to you. And this is starting on page 1. I've cut and sliced and diced the pages a little to make them fit. We're not going to read all the stuff over on the sides. You can look at that as we read, although this really bothers me here, the law of supply and demand, just because I was an economics major in college, and this is a pretty glaring error here. It says there's an economic law called the law of supply and demand. If there is a big supply of something, the price and the demand for it usually goes down. That is ridiculous. With most goods, if there's a big supply of it, it is true that the price will go down, but the demand, the amount that people want, goes up for something when the price goes down. So we're going to just cross that part out and don't read it. All right. All right. Back to the story, or to the story, because we haven't started. And I have to say, the history part is good. The writing part is kind of a little, you'll see what I mean. Now we're finally getting to the reading. Imagine a city built of wooden blocks. Do you see it in your mind? Make sure it has houses and bridges and walls. Knock it down. Now build it again. Which takes longer, destroying or building? The answer is supposed to be building takes a lot longer. See, we could have done without all that, right? And you could do without all my commentary about all that too, right? All right, back to the story. Which is harder? It's the same way with governments. Okay, this is getting better now. Revolutions are difficult. Overthrowing Britain wasn't easy at all for the American colonies. But building a strong nation was much harder. The American Revolution was unusual. It produced people who were good at nation building. When you study other revolutions, like the ones in France and Russia, you'll see how lucky we were. That is so, so true. At first, though, it looked like it might not happen. It seemed as if the 13 states would never get along. They certainly weren't united. Each state was printing its own money and making its own rules. 11 states had their own navies. Virginia's navy had 72 ships. The Continental Congress was trying to run a national government, and it had a navy too, but it was smaller than Virginia's. The Congress was also printing money. As you can guess, soon none of the money was worth anything, and that was terrible for most citizens. Besides that, each state got into the taxing business. New York was taxing goods from New Jersey, and New Jersey was taxing goods from New York. Virginia and Maryland were squabbling over boundary lines. Little states were jealous of big states and vice versa. In Massachusetts, some farmers rebelled against the government in Boston. All right, pause for a second. I'll put that dot right there so we know where we are. That rebellion, you should know from a previous episode, was called Shays' Rebellion. And we'll talk about it again in class probably because Shays' Rebellion is kind of important. Also, as long as we're paused here, we're going to take a look over at this map. When they say we're squabbling over boundary lines, this is what it means. All of this land out here west of the Appalachian Mountains was claimed by lots of different people, states. Different states were claiming, like, for example, Massachusetts claimed up here. This was Connecticut. This was claimed by Massachusetts and New York and Connecticut. This part of Pennsylvania, New York claimed land up here. So it was really a mess. And there was a good chance that these states, could start fighting one another. Back to our story. In Philadelphia and New York, newspapers reported a movement to create 3 separate nations out of the 13 former colonies. In England, people were saying that the Americans would soon be begging to be taken back. They were literally singing, "You will be back." There's a little Hamilton reference joke if you know what I'm talking about. If not, someday you will. As you can see, the United States got off to a rocky start. We didn't have a good I can't read that word, plan for a government, I'm going to guess it says. We didn't begin with the Constitution we now have. The first Constitution of the United States was called, and memorize this, you're going to have to know it, the Articles of Confederation. It didn't work well at all. That was because the American citizens were afraid of political power. They had a bad experience with kings and parliament. They were afraid of a strong Congress and a strong president. So they went to the other extreme. They didn't give Congress the power to do much of anything. There was no president except the president of the Congress. And there wasn't much he could do either. Oh, this is one of the things that really annoys me about this book, this attempt at humor, but bad history. Ask anyone, who was the first president of our country? And the answer will be George Washington. That's because it is the correct answer. George Washington was the first president of our country. Don't believe anything you read if it tells you otherwise. But you can say that the first president was John Hanson. You can say it, but you will be wrong. Very few people will believe you, and they shouldn't believe you because you're wrong. It's true, though. No, it's not. Hanson became president, not really, under the Articles of Confederation. That part is true. On November 5th, 1781. President Hanson didn't make himself remembered because he had no power. We're going to pause for 1 second here, and this is what they're talking about. Under the Articles of Confederation, you might remember that the Congress, the national legislature, the Continental Congress, later called the Confederation Congress, but we're going to stick with it, they were the government. There was no president, there were no courts, it was the Congress. There were various people who were presidents of the Congress at various times. Oh, whoa, what happened here? Sorry. These are some of the people who were president of the Congress. And what this person is claiming is that because John Hanson was president in 1781 at the time that the war actually ended, he was the first president. But that's ridiculous. He was president of the Congress. There were lots of other people who had been, you could say, well, what about John Hancock? He was president of the Congress when we declared independence. All right. What about Nathaniel Gorham of Massachusetts? He was president of the Congress for a short period of time in 1786. But more importantly, Nathaniel Gorham, you might remember him from previous videos if you actually watch them. Nathaniel Gorham was instrumental. He bought all the land that we live on today in Canandaigua. He and his friend Phelps owned all of it. So no matter where you live in this area, he owned your property at one point. And his son settled in Canandaigua, was one of the first settlers, and has a street named after him and a town, I believe. Back to the story. Where were we? Up here. We're going to say right here. In 1781, Americans were facing one of the toughest problems there can be in designing a government. How do you provide freedom for each person and still have a government powerful enough to accomplish things? You have to give up some freedom when you are part of a society that is ruled by laws. The question is, how much do you give up? The Americans at the end of the 18th century had just fought hard for liberty. They weren't about to give up much at all. They went too far, but they learned. The national government, under the Articles of Confederation, was just too weak. Always remember that. Under the Articles of Confederation, the national government was too weak. Everyone seemed to know it. Most of the time, the states wouldn't even send representatives to Philadelphia to vote for meetings of the Congress. A lot of people felt that voting wasn't fair, anyways. This is kind of important. Each state had an equal vote in Congress. Each state had an equal vote in Congress. That meant that 68,000 Rhode Islanders had one vote. That means like they had their representatives in Congress when they called the roll and voted. Rhode Island, how do you vote? Rhode Island has one vote. And 747 Virginians combined for one vote. Then something really insulting happened. In 1783, Congress got chased out of Philadelphia by its own army because it hadn't paid the soldiers their salaries. But Congress had no money to pay the salaries and no power to collect taxes. And it is tax money that governments use to pay their bills. It would take 6 years for the people living in this land to create a workable kind of government. At first, the former colonists didn't even know what to call themselves. We began as a nation without a name. Some called us the American Commonwealth. Others said the American Confederation. Some talked of, quote, United States, no capital letters there, and a few said the United States. Most people still thought of themselves first as citizens of the state they lived in. They were having a hard time accepting the idea of a nation that might be more important and more powerful than their separate and beloved. Let's get to the end of this and I'll come back. States. They didn't even like the word nation. They called it a union of states. People in the territories felt the same way. You already know about independent Vermont. No, you don't, because we didn't read that chapter. Well, some people tried to make Kentucky into a nation too. In 1792, the Commonwealth of Kentucky became the first state west of the Appalachian Mountains. There was even a state that called itself Franklin. Well, not really a state. A hope to be state, maybe, off to the west of North Carolina. It was territory where the mound builders had once flourished. Before long, Franklin became a state with an Indian name, Tennessee. Settlers were filling up the Ohio River Valley, and that was causing problems. Much of that western land was claimed by Virginia, but other big states were claiming some of it too. The states without western lands were jealous. How could arguments between the states be settled unless a central government had more power than any one state? What are they going to do? There was one good thing about the Articles of Confederation. They were so weak that they made a strong constitution possible. All right, and this is just showing how all the lands they fought over were potentially fighting over. Just going back up here, things to know. Articles of Confederation were so weak. The national government was so weak. Why was the national government so weak? Let's back it up and I'll give you the motion here. All right, because President and Supreme Court are now important parts of our government, but those did not exist. How's that for special effects? Those did not exist under the Articles of Confederation. No president, no federal or national court system. And big one here, if you're going to do something as a government, you need money. And to get money, you need taxes. And they could not collect taxes, so they had no money, so they had no power, so they were weak. All right, that's really all you need to know. I will, hopefully you will either enjoy your break or did enjoy your break, and I will see you guys soon.